Imagine holding a magical tool, a technique that all pro photographers use to capture perfectly exposed photos in any situation without ever having overexposed or underexposed areas. This technique is something you have surely heard about at least once, but it often remains shrouded in mystery. Yes, I would like to talk about this weird little graph that seems to make no sense when you're starting out in wildlife photography and is called the histogram. Today, we are going to decipher this technique, and I promise you that with this video, the histogram will no longer hold any secrets for you, even if you have never understood it before. So stay until the end, because you will finally be able to understand the histogram, use it like a pro, and most importantly, greatly improve the exposure of your photos. So to understand how the histogram works, understanding what a photo is made of is necessary. And if you think about it, a photo is nothing more than a succession of several million pixels placed next to each other in a line, which, when zoomed out a lot, together form an image. Have you ever wondered what a pixel is? Well, a pixel is just a square, a tiny little square that contains a simple patch of color inside and absolutely nothing else but a single unique color. And a digital color can be broken down into three easy to understand criteria: hue, saturation, and brightness. So we will set aside hue and saturation to focus only on brightness, which is the value that really interests us for this video. When discussing the brightness of a color, it must be expressed on a scale ranging from 0 to 255. 0 is equivalent to a pure black pixel and 255 to a pure white pixel, and between these two extremes there are millions and millions of slightly different and unique colors that all have one thing in common. Each of them will have a brightness value between 0 and 255, our famous brightness scale. This blue square has a brightness of 144, the red has a brightness of 238, the brown is 45, the orange is 128, and so on. Let's now take this very simplified drawing. If I wanted to, I could easily count the number of pixels that make it up and arrange them on a horizontal axis. And on this axis to the left we are at 0 and to the right we are at 255. Remember, this is our famous brightness scale coming back again. And so in my drawing I can see there are 5 squares with brightness value of 135. So what I'm going to do is take these 5 squares and stack them on top of each other on my diagram at the exact value of 135 to arrange them neatly. Now what I'm going to do is the same with these 3 squares that have a brightness of 24, these 6 squares at 228, and so on, until I have perfectly arranged them all on my diagram. So I hope you are starting to see where I'm going with this, because in a photograph it will work exactly the same way. We will be able to precisely classify each individual pixel according to its brightness value on the same diagram, with the only difference being that it will involve millions and millions of tiny colored pixels which, once classified side by side, will form a kind of unique curve with peaks, waves, and troughs, and that's what we call a histogram. And a histogram is really just that. It's simply the distribution of all those millions of pixels on a graph that goes from 0 to 255 on the horizontal axis and simply accumulates the number of pixels for each value on the vertical axis. It's as simple as that. By the way, we will find a really cool tool in Photoshop that will allow you to concretely understand what I just explained. I recommend you have fun with it. This tool is very simple to activate. Just open a photograph in Photoshop and go to the Windows tab at the top, and to look for the option called histogram, which will allow us to display the histogram of our photograph, similar to what we are used to seeing on our camera or in Lightroom. The only difference here is that by clicking on this small and easily noticeable icon at the very top right corner of the tab, we will be able to activate a significantly enlarged display that will allow us to have a lot of detailed information about our photograph. I'll let you go through all, but we're going to have different display options in this tool. Default, we have the color display that will appear. I recommend enabling the option called brightness, which will allow you to focus solely on the brightness values of your photograph, but you can also enable certain histograms according to the RGB channels of your photograph. So for now, I will focus on the brightness histogram. So the first thing that's super interesting here is that we're going to have different information about our photograph. First, we can see that the average brightness of my pixels is around 210.65, so on a scale that goes from 0 to 255, which allows us to easily understand that we have a well-exposed photograph that is very, very bright. In fact, we can see this with the histogram since we have a curve that is rather compressed towards the right. We wouldn't even need to look at the photograph to understand that we have a photo that tends to be very bright. But we will also find other information that is super interesting. We will count the pixels in my photo. For example, this photo has exactly 93,368,064 pixels. And where it gets interesting is that if I click on my curve on the histogram with the mouse, if I left click, for example, example, at this specific location, you'll see that the information at the bottom right will actually update. So what I did here is I clicked on my histogram at level 155 out of 255. And we see that for the brightness value of 155, I will have exactly 34,521 pixels in my photograph, which will have the brightness value of 155. So it's an interesting tool that lets you grasp what I explained to you. If I click on this area, I will go to level 207, and we see we have 208,268 pixels in the photograph with a brightness level of 207. It's something fascinating. I invite you to test all this and explore it. This allows you to have this kind of information very easily on your photograph. So, one last little tip with this tool, you have the possibility, if you activate the selection tool, for example the rectangular selection tool, you have the possibility, if you make a selection of a part of your image, to look closely at the histogram when I release the left click of my mouse. Look, the histogram is going to change completely. In fact, it will adapt to only show me the pixels that are within my rectangular frame, and so this will allow me to activate small histograms. This can be particularly interesting for checking, for example, a very small part of our image to ensure there are no blown out or underexposed areas in that part. So it allows you to activate this kind of temporary histogram and thus get a better reading on certain parts. For example, if I wanted to check that there are no blocked areas around the collar, I could make a selection which would allow me to have the curve of only the selection I just made. And so here you see that I have a reading level that is much more interesting and much more precise than if I activated the general histogram of my photograph. Here, for example, we might see on the histogram that we could potentially have some pixels that are clipped. If I simply activate here, if I just click and drag my mouse over this value, we can see that I have approximately 387 pixels with a value close to level 0. This allows me to know that I have a few more pixels that are slightly blocked in the part I just selected. So that was really for the theoretical part of the histogram, but now how do you use it in the field? Well, it's very simple, because on all camera models, regardless of the brand or model you are going to use, you will have the ability to display a histogram in real time, which will allow you to control your exposure in the field and thus avoid having photos that are too overexposed or too underexposed. To access this type of histogram, it's very simple. You have two options. The first is to take a photograph and then display the histogram on the image that was taken. So for example, if I come to take a photo here, if I press the shutter button, I will take my photograph. Now, I just need to view the photograph on the rear screen of my camera, which is a high resolution display and offers great detail. My photograph displays, I need to press a button. It's the info button located at the back of the camera. On Nikon, it will be the display button, but you also have the same thing on Sony or Fujifilm. You will have a button that allows you to toggle the information. For example, if I press the info button here, you will see that after a moment, I will be able to bring up the histogram of my photograph, which allows me to control the exposure of my image in real time. This is the first way to control your photography and display a histogram. It's not what I recommend, as it's not practical. In fact, we also have the possibility to do this directly at the time of shooting. So if I go back here to photo mode, you will see that if I press this info button again, or the display button if you are using Nikon, you will see that after a moment you will also be able to display a histogram, which will be a real-time histogram. So if you change your different settings now, you will see that this histogram will be affected, which will allow you to continuously and in real time control the histogram of your photograph. So be careful, the histogram will obviously change when I adjust my different settings that will impact the exposure of the photograph. However, it will also change, the histogram will also evolve if I change my composition. So you will also need to be careful. Beyond the settings you use, you will need to pay attention to what appears in the frame of your image, because you can see that here the histogram will constantly evolve. So pay close attention to this. There are two things to consider: the settings you will use that will impact the histogram, and also what will appear in your image, which will also affect the histogram. So in this situation, the idea will be to adjust the settings to change my exposure and so constantly monitor the histogram. For example, if you see here that I change my observation speed, you will see that the histogram shifts completely to the right, which indicates that the photograph will be overexposed. We can see this especially because there will be a significant peak that is stuck to the right side of the histogram, which indicates that we are going to have almost pure whites in our photograph. And when we have pure whites in our image, it can pose a very big problem because we will have a loss of data, which means that if you import your photograph, for example, into a post-processing software, the problem is that when you underexpose your photograph to try to recover the overexposed parts, since you have pure white, when you decrease the exposure, you will end up with gray areas, which is really very very unappealing. And we will also have the same problem if we underexpose our image a little too much. So for example, if I lower my shutter speed, you will see that after a while, the histogram will be completely compressed to the left, and we will have very significant peaks on the left side, which indicates that we will have pure blacks. And this is also the same problem if we import our photograph into a post-processing software. If we overexpose the parts that are too dark in our image, we will end up with grays, which is also very unaesthetic. So the goal of the histogram is to try to find a good balance, not having areas that are too overexposed and areas that are too dark in our image, which allows us to have a more or less balanced histogram with values ranging from 0 to 255, as we saw in the theoretical part earlier in this video. So another tip when you're out in the field, be very careful if you have, for example, an animal with white fur or white feathers, which can be the case with certain birds. We might get the impression that our histogram doesn't have any overexposed areas when it actually does. For example, to show you this, I turned on my small lamp, which allows me to have a very bright area in my image. If we don't focus on the histogram, we might think the histogram is well balanced because we don't have many overexposed or underexposed areas. The problem is that I'm going to try to zoom into the image. Look at my histogram. I really have a peak that is stuck all the way to the right, which is the value of 255 on our brightness scale. And look, we have a huge peak on the right that is very subtle. And if we're not careful, we can end up with overexposed areas in our image, which is the case here, as the pixels corresponding to the lamp are blown out. And we can see this if I underexpose my photograph. Look here, it really actually appears like there's indeed absolutely nothing about overexposure. But if I keep underexposing, you'll see that the peak that was hidden, completely stuck on the right, well, we'll definitely find it right here. And so you need to be careful with this. It's something you'll encounter, as I mentioned, if you're photographing subjects that are completely white and there's, for example, a lot of sunlight. You can find yourself in this situation, feeling like the parts are not overexposed, and it's misleading because those pixels that are overexposed are very subtle. They will be completely stuck together at the value 255 of our histogram. So be very careful about that. To counter this kind of problem, I also advise you to activate another setting that is available on the vast majority of cameras, which is called the overexposure alert. So to activate this setting, it's very simple. You just need to go to the camera's menu. On Canon, you'll find it in the playback menu. Generally, with other brands, it will be in the exact same place. And if I come here to change the page, we will see that on page number 7 with Canon, we have the option called overexposure alert, which will allow you to address this kind of problem, since it will enable you to be able to visualize the blown out areas in your photographs, such as the bright spots, for example. This feature is very useful. So I'm going to enable it right now here on my Canon R6 II. I'll let you find it on your specific camera. It will have a nearly similar name on Nikon or Sony. And so once I have activated this setting, what I will do is go back to my photo shoot. I will overexpose my image to get a somewhat normal exposure on my photograph. So then I can take this photograph thinking that there are no overexposed areas on my image. So I will shoot like this. And now you will see that if I go to the photo playback. Since I have activated a small overexposure alert, you can see here that the parts which are completely white in my image will blink in black. This is what we call the overexposure alert, which allows us to fix this kind of problem and ensure that we don't have any overexposed areas in our image thanks to this little overexposure alert. Okay, so now that we know how to use the histogram in the field, one might wonder, what is a good histogram? And above all, isn't there perhaps maybe some kind of magic curve to ensure good exposure every time? Well, unfortunately, at the risk of disappointing you, I'm going to say no, because it really depends on each situation and especially on the result you want to achieve. For example, if we look at this curve that appears on the screen, one might think that my photograph is way too underexposed, and yet this is exactly the type of ambiance I wanted to achieve with very dense blacks in order to create a low-key effect right from the shot. On the other hand, if we look at this curve, one might think that my photo is this time way too overexposed because the curve is quite to the right, but I actually needed this overexposure to reproduce the brightness of the snow in full sunlight all around my subject. So clearly it will really depend on the situation, but even more on your tastes and personal desires. And there isn't any rule or magic formula. The only rule I would truly advise when you use the histogram is to make sure you don't have too many peaks on either side of your curve, which could indicate that you have blown out or blocked up areas in your image that will be impossible to recover in post-processing. But for the rest, it's too dependent on each situation, so don't hesitate to experiment according to your tastes. And don't listen to those who tell you your curve must be a specific shape, because that's false. It depends on the situation and your preferences. One last thing to know, if you are shooting in RAW, be very careful, because the photo that appears on the back of the camera is not really the RAW file, but a JPEG preview of your photo generated by the camera to display the image on the rear screen or in the viewfinder of your camera. So the histogram that appears directly on the camera is that of the JPEG preview, which naturally has a more limited dynamic range compared to a true RAW file. And so it's really something to know, because if you shoot in RAW and you see on your camera that there are some blocked or overexposed areas on the back screen of your camera, well, it's very, very likely that when you open the RAW file on a computer, it will be very different and you'll eventually be able to recover information in those areas. So if you shoot in RAW, really my advice, always keep this in mind, because it will also allow you to use the technique of exposing to the right, which is a great tip for getting the best possible quality in your photos. But I will talk to you about this technique in an upcoming video. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't, to make sure you don't miss it. In the meantime, if you would like to quickly improve in wildlife photography and especially bring much more creativity to your images, you can download my 3 free PDF guides that have just appeared on the screen. In them, I reveal tips that have allowed me to win several photo contests. If you're interested, just click on the small thumbnail located just to my left to be automatically redirected to the download page. And if you would like to discover plenty of tips for getting much sharper images, don't hesitate to also watch the next video, which is right here. In any case, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon for a new video.